Palisades has the rides, Palisades has the fun. Come on over. Shows and dancing are free, so's the parking, so gee. Come on over.
4 glass towers stand on a cliff in Cliffside Park, New Jersey, staring straight across the Hudson River at the Manhattan skyline. Nice view, expensive rent. Nothing unusual at first glance. Except for 73 years, this exact patch of rock was home to the most famous amusement park in America. Millions of people rode roller coasters right here. They swam in a saltwater pool the size of several football fields. They danced to Benny Goodman with that same skyline glowing behind the stage. This place was so beloved, it had its own top 3 song on the Billboard charts, the kind of tune you've probably heard on oldies radio without ever knowing what it was actually about. Then, almost overnight, all of it disappeared. No roller coaster, no funhouse, no ticket booth, just apartments. So what actually happened here? And how does something this massive just vanish? Birth of a legend. Let's go back to 1898. There's no amusement park here yet, just raw, undeveloped land on top of the Palisades Cliffs, owned by a streetcar company called the Bergen County Traction Company. And streetcar companies back then had one specific problem. Weekdays were fine. Everyone needed the trolley to get to work. But nights and weekends, the cars sat empty. So the company got creative. They bought 38 acres of cliffside land straddling Cliffside Park and Fort Lee and turned it into a scenic picnic ground. Just flower gardens, walking paths, and open lawns, all to give people a reason to ride the trolley on a day off. They called it the Park on the Palisades. For about a decade, that's really all it was, a nice place to spread a blanket and admire the view. Then, in 1908, new owners brought in a showman named Alvin Dexter, fresh off running the Boston Opera House, and he blew the place wide open. In a single season, he added a carousel, games of chance, a dancing pavilion, and, this is a real detail, a Wild West show with actual performing cowboys. Dexter never lived to see where he took it. He died of pneumonia the following spring, but the park already had its permanent name by then, Palisades Amusement Park, and it was already booking dirigible flights and high-diving horses that leapt off platforms straight into pools of water. Then, in 1910, everything changed. Brothers Joseph and Nicholas Schenck bought the property, and if those names sound familiar, it's because the Schencks were also becoming, at that exact same moment, 2 of the most powerful men in the early movie business. Nicholas ended up running the company behind MGM. Joseph helped build what became 20th Century Fox. These were men who sold spectacle for a living, and they poured that instinct straight into Palisades. Their biggest swing came in 1913 when they unveiled a saltwater pool so enormous the park advertised it for decades as the largest outdoor saltwater pool in the world. And this wasn't water trucked in from somewhere. It was pumped directly out of the Hudson River, 200 feet below the cliffs, straight up into the park, waves and all. Whether it technically held the actual world record is still argued about by historians today, but nobody who swam in it walked away doubting it was salty, and nobody who saw it doubted it was massive. Here's the detail that made Palisades different from every other amusement park in America. Nowhere else could you drop down a coaster hill or float on your back in that pool and look up to see the entire Manhattan skyline sitting right there across the water. That view was free, nobody could copy it, and it would end up being the exact thing that destroyed the park. The Golden Age. By the early 1930s, the Schencks were pivoting hard into Hollywood, and in 1934, they leased the park to 2 brothers, Jack and Irving Rosenthal, who bought it outright for the following year for $450,000. The Rosenthals weren't new to this business. They'd made their fortune as concessionaires at Coney Island, And just a few years earlier, they'd built a wooden roller coaster there that's still running and still a landmark to this day, the Coney Island Cyclone. Under the Rosenthals, Palisades stopped being just a park. It became, in their own advertising, quote, the world's greatest amusement resort. And for once, the marketing wasn't lying. A fire tore through the park in 1944 and destroyed one of its signature rides. But out of the ashes in 1945, the Rosenthals built a brand new wooden coaster and gave it the family's signature name, the Cyclone. It became the sound of the entire park. Click, click, click up the lift hill. Total silence at the top. Then the screaming all the way down. But the thing that turned Palisades from a regional amusement park into a genuine American institution was the open-air music pavilion. This wasn't some stage with a local cover band. Benny Goodman played there. So did Cab Calloway. So did Tony Bennett, Chubby Checker, Frankie Avalon, the Jackson 5, and Diana Ross and the Supremes. Local radio DJs like Clay Cole and the legendary Cousin Brucey Morrow broadcast live from the park and dragged these acts through, sometimes several in a single summer. And because a live band wasn't always in the budget, performers frequently lip-synced to their own records over the park's sound system, which led to one of the most famous stories to come out of Palisades. Tony Bennett reportedly did not want to lip-sync, he wanted to sing live. Cousin Brucey talked him into it anyway, and halfway through I Left My Heart in San Francisco, the record started skipping. Over and over, the crowd heard him leave his heart in San Francisco, Cisco, Cisco, stuck on the same broken groove while Bennett stood there and took it. According to Cousin Brucey, Bennett never quite forgave him. If you're enjoying this dive into a place most people have completely forgotten existed, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because there's a lot more forgotten American history where this came from. Now let's talk numbers, because this is where things get almost hard to believe. From 1947 through 1971, the park averaged something like 6 million visitors a year. And in its single best season, 1969, it topped 10 million. That's more people walking through the gates in one summer than the entire population of New York City at the time. Then in 1962, something happened that took Palisades from a regional legend to a name known coast to coast, and it happened almost by accident. A songwriter named Chuck Barris, who would later become famous as the host of The Gong Show, wrote an upbeat little rock and roll tune about the park after spotting the cliffs from across the river one night in Manhattan. He handed it to a singer named Freddie Cannon, and it got tucked onto the B-side of another single, practically an afterthought. Then a radio DJ out in Flint, Michigan, played the wrong side of the record by mistake. That mistake became Palisades Park. By the summer of 1962, it had climbed all the way to number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100, and it stayed on the charts for 15 weeks. The song name-checks half the rides in the place: the Tunnel of Love, the Ferris wheel, the roller coaster, and it's built around sound effects meant to sound like screaming riders. For a lot of Americans who'd never once set foot in New Jersey, this 3-minute song became their entire mental image of the place. People are still spinning it on oldies stations right now, more than 60 years later. The park leaned all the way into being a full pop culture machine, not just a place with rides. There was the Little Miss America pageant, one of the first national pageants built specifically for young girls, televised locally every summer. There was the Miss American Teenager pageant. There was something called the Diaper Derby, exactly what it sounds like: infants racing on all fours toward a finish line while parents cheered them on. The back pages of comic books from both DC and Archie carried Palisades Park ads for years, complete with little clip-out coupons kids could bring in for a free ride. And through all of it, everyone remembered the French fries, doused in malt vinegar, sold at little stands all over the Midway. But golden ages are never golden for everyone, and Palisades had a chapter it never put on the postcards. In the mid-1940s, the park ran its famous saltwater pool through a so-called private membership club, a workaround that kept black visitors out, even though New Jersey law technically barred that kind of discrimination. In the summer of 1947, a young black woman named Melba Valley was turned away and reportedly forcibly removed from the property, which set off organized weekly protests right at the park's entrance. It took a few more years and a change in state civil rights law before that policy was actually forced to end. That part of the story doesn't usually make it into the nostalgic version, but it happened right alongside the rock and roll shows and the beauty pageants on the very same 38 acres. But the same qualities that made Palisades legendary were already setting up its downfall. By the 1960s, the park wasn't just popular, it was overwhelming. On a hot Saturday, cars trying to reach it backed up for miles through Cliffside Park and Fort Lee, two towns that had grown into quiet, increasingly upscale residential neighborhoods. The park's own lots couldn't handle the crowds, so management opened an overflow lot at the bottom of the cliff in Edgewater and ran shuttle buses up the hill. Even that filled most weekends, and drivers ended up parking on residential streets far from the entrance. And on top of the traffic, ride-related injuries were climbing too, as both the crowds and the aging equipment grew. Local residents had finally had enough. They weren't the ones riding the cyclone on a Tuesday night. They were the ones who lived a block away and couldn't get their own car out of the driveway on a summer weekend. They pushed their local governments hard, demanding something be done about the noise, the litter, and the gridlock. And here's where this stops being just one story about one amusement park in New Jersey, because this next part has played out in dozens of towns across America. Once local officials started paying attention, developers realized something the Rosenthals had known all along, that unbeatable, one-of-a-kind view of the Manhattan skyline. Except now they weren't looking at it as a backdrop for a roller coaster, they were looking at it as the single best selling point for luxury apartments anyone could imagine. That view, sold as a 30th floor amenity instead of amusement park scenery, was suddenly worth an almost unimaginable amount of money. Local government rezoned the land for high-rise residential development and leaned on the threat of eminent domain to keep things moving. And by then, the man at the top, Irving Rosenthal, was in his 70s. His brother Jack had died years earlier, and Irving had no children of his own to hand the park down to. He held out for a long time, reportedly turning down offer after offer because he genuinely loved the place. But eventually, with no heir and no realistic path to keep fighting the zoning battle forever, he agreed to sell. In January of 1971, a Texas-based real estate firm called Winston Centex Corporation bought the 38 acres for $12.5 million. As part of the deal, they let Rosenthal run the park for one final season before it all came down. One more summer. That's all he got. The Vanishing. That final season ended on Sunday, September 12, 1971. By most accounts, the last day felt less like a funeral and more like one enormous final party, packed with people who'd grown up there trying to ride everything one more time. The last person ever recorded swimming in that giant saltwater pool was a young man named Kurt Kellinger, whose own father happened to be the pool's manager. When the gates closed that night, 73 years of history closed with them. A few desperate attempts were made afterward to reopen for even one more summer, but local officials refused to renew the business license, and that was that. Demolition crews moved in. Most of the rides weren't destroyed outright. They were dismantled, sold off, and trucked out to amusement parks across the United States and into Canada. The park's carousel, by some accounts, is still spinning today at a park in Canada. But the Cyclone, the wooden coaster that had defined the sound of the place for a generation, couldn't be saved the same way. Its massive wooden structure was bulldozed in February of 1972. A handful of its actual ride cars survived in storage for decades, and one eventually made it back to Fort Lee, as close to a physical relic of the ride as anyone was ever going to get. And then, on those 38 acres where millions of people had once screamed their way down a coaster hill, 4 luxury high-rise towers went up. Winston Towers, Carlisle Towers, the Royal Buckingham. That view of the Manhattan skyline, the one thing about Palisades nobody else could ever copy, is still there. It's just being sold now to people paying rent instead of an admission ticket. If you go looking today, you won't find a single ride, or a ticket booth, or a trace of pavement from the Midway. But there is one small thing. Near the site's old main entrance by Winston Towers sits a modest monument tucked into a little traffic median most drivers never look twice at. The plaque on it reads simply, "Dedicated to the memory of Palisades Amusement Park. Here, we were happy." And the song lives on too, still spinning on oldies radio somewhere, right now, this exact minute, in a car or a kitchen you'll never see. The man who wrote it, Chuck Barris, has since passed away. So has the man who actually sang it, Freddie Boom Boom Cannon. Both men behind that song are gone now. The song isn't. Most people driving past those 4 towers today have no idea what used to stand there. They're just looking at apartments with a nice view. But for 73 years, for millions of people, this was the place. And in 3 minutes and change, on a scratchy old 45, some small part of it never actually left. Here, we were happy. So next time that song comes on, that goofy, upbeat little tune about a roller coaster in a tunnel of love, you'll know it's not just an oldies deep cut. It's basically the last living piece of an entire world that used to sit on top of those cliffs. If you want more videos digging up places like this one, massive, beloved, and then quietly erased, get subscribed, because there are plenty more of these stories still waiting to be told. Thanks for spending this time with me, and I'll see you in the next one.